So, Chapter 15 in the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane. Find out what happened to Edward as he was kicked off the train. In the morning, the sun rose and the cricket song gave way to bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. "Ha!" she said, and she pushed Edward with her fishing rod. "Looks like a rabbit," she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. "Only he ain't real." She stood up. She said again and rubbed her back. "What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say." Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. "Pick me up or don't pick me up," the rabbit thought. "Makes no difference to me." The old lady picked him up. She bent double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish, and then she kept walking and swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. "I've seen troubles too," he thought. "You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet." Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a post in her vegetable garden. She nailed his ears to the wooden post and spread his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the post by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward pie tins hung from the post. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. "Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare 'em off," the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. "Go on, Clyde," said the woman, and she clapped her hands. "You got to act ferocious." Clyde? Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. "Get to work, Clyde," she said. "Scare them birds off." And she walked away from him, out of the garden and towards her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew round his head, they tugged at the loose threads of his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the post and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. "Caw, caw, caw," without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I am done with caring. "Caw, caw," said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked up at the night stars. He saw the stars. But for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. "You are down there alone," the stars seemed to say to him, "and we are up here in our constellations together." "I have been loved," Edward told the stars. "So?" said the stars. "What difference does that make when you're all alone now?" Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. There's Edward, a scare rabbit. Chapter 16. Bryce, said the old woman, get away from that rabbit. I ain't paying you to stand and stare. Yes, ma'am, said Bryce. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and continued to look up at Edward. The boy's eyes were brown with flecks of gold shining in them. Hey, he whispered to Edward. A crow settled on Edward's head, and the boy flapped his arms and shouted, Go on, get! And the bird spread its wings and flew away. Bryce, shouted the woman. Ma'am, said Bryce, get away from that rabbit. Do your work. I ain't going to say it again. Yes, ma'am, said Bryce. He wiped his hands across his nose. I'll get back to you, he said to Edward. The rabbit spent the day hanging by his ears, baking in the hot sun, watching the old woman and Bryce weed and hoe the garden. Whenever the woman wasn't looking, Bryce raised his hand and waved. The birds circled over Edward's head, laughing at him. What was it like to have wings? Edward wondered. If he had had wings when he was tossed overboard, he would not have sunk to the bottom of the sea. Instead, he would have flown in the opposite direction, up into the deep, bright blue sky. And when Lolly took him to the dump, he would have flown out of the rubbish and followed her and landed on her head, holding on with his sharp claws. And on the train, when the man kicked him, Edward would not have fallen to the ground. Instead, he would have risen up, sat on top of the train and laughed at the man. Caw, caw, caw. In the late afternoon, Bryce and the old lady left the garden. Bryce winked at Edward as he walked past him. One of the crows lighted on Edward's shoulders and tapped with his beak at Edward's china face, reminding the rabbit with each tap that he had no wings, that not only could he not fly, he could not move on his own at all, in any way. Dusk descended over the garden, and then came true dark. A whippoorwill sang out over and over again, Whippoorwill, whippoorwill. It was the saddest sound Edward had ever heard. And then came another sound, the hum of a harmonica. Bryce stepped out of the shadows. Hey, he said to Edward. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then played another bit of a song on the harmonica. I bet you didn't think I'd come back, but here I am. I've come to save you. Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce climbed the post and worked at the wires that were tied around his wrists. I am nothing but a hollow rabbit. Too late, thought Edward, as Bryce pulled the nails out of his ears. I am only a doll made of china. But when the last nail was out and he fell forward into Bryce's arms, the rabbit felt a rush of relief, and the feeling of relief was followed by one of joy. Perhaps, he thought, if it's not too late, after all, I might be saved. End of chapter 16. We now wait tomorrow, Year 4, to find out what happened in chapter 17. Bye.